Everyone. My name is Caroline Colas, and I am the Senior Director of Health and Wellness at the Marlene Meyerson JCC Manhattan. Thank you so much for joining me today on the Positive Psychology Hour, a series with the conjunction with the Whole Being Institute and the Marlene Meyerson JCC Manhattan. Today, we are going to be discussing Busting Through Burnout, the Marathon of COVID with Gary Redfeather and Sherry Kelly. This is part 2. Do you feel like COVID-19 has been a marathon of fatigue, loss, and uncertainty? Well, you're not alone. Today, ultra-marathoner and post-traumatic growth PTG expert Gary Redfeather, PhD, and clinical neuropsychologist Sherry Kelly, PhD, are going to be discussing the powerful insights in busting through COVID burnout. This uplifting Lunch and Learn webinar will highlight real-life applications of post-traumatic growth and the resilience research in your personal life and your career. After a year of COVID and now the availability of vaccines, in fact, we just heard today that New York's at 70%. So at 12:15, Governor Cuomo is going to be announcing whether we're going to open completely or not. So there's lots of excitement around right now. We are further along in the pandemic journey in terms of time, but where are we with our emotions? We are transitioning from a marathon of prolonged crisis to essentially a marathon of coping. And how can we learn factors like perception, perceived control, sense of self, and coping style? How can these things help us towards positive change during this protracted period of time and stress? So we're going to discuss that. We've got 2 experts to talk about that. Sherry Schuyler Kelly is a clinical psychologist and neuropsychologist with more than 30 years of experience in the field of child development and health psychology. And Gary Redfeather runs the postgraduate clinical leadership education and research program at De Montfort University in Leicester, England, as well as numerous leader development programs in the US. I welcome them both to the call, and thank you so much for joining me at this time. Hi, you guys.
Hello.
Sherry, you're going to have to unmute.
Mute. There I am. Hi.
Fantastic. I'm going to let you take it away. Let me know if I can help in any way.
Well, thank you, everyone. It's great to be here. It's great to see Gary from across the Atlantic.
Hello.
And we're so thrilled to be here for part 2 of this very important topic. So many of us are just feeling stuck, fatigued, burned out, like we've hit the wall. And hitting the wall is something we talked about last time, because that's a word that I believe originated with marathoning. And Gary and I are both, well, I'm a former long distance runner. Gary is a real long distance runner. So I am hearing some background noise. I'm not sure where it's coming from. Maybe someone is not muted.
No one else is on mute. So why don't you, when one of you is speaking, what you might want to do is mute the other.
There you go. There's Gary. Okay. So, I just want you to take a moment, just do some grounding with us right now. Just take a deep breath and realize that this time is for you. So often we're running around doing things for other people, not thinking about what you need, or even perhaps processing the stress in your life and trying to come to terms with it and understand it. And that's what Gary and I want to do today, is to help you get some deeper understanding of what you've been through emotionally, and how we can move forward, how we can take a path of pain that we may have experienced to a path of progress, personal progress. So that's my intention. That's hopefully something that you'll feel that I'm sharing with authenticity with you today. I'm going to pass it to Gary and see if he wants to kick it off with something.
I just want to say a hearty welcome from the UK. Things here are not necessarily any better or any worse than what's happening in the US. We've already been told that our lockdown release that was going to happen in about a week is not going to happen now. So we're officially postponed until July. So our marathon / ultra marathon that we're talking about is actually officially extended on this end already, and we'll see how much longer it may be extended. So what we'll discuss today, I think, is very relevant because we're not too sure where we're at in this long distance event we call the pandemic. So happy to be here.
So I'm going to share screen. Here we go. So this is where we started, and I hope everybody can hear me. I think they can. We started talking about, the hitting the wall and what's that like in a marathon. And that's something that we've experienced also with the long-term experience of this pandemic lasting almost a year and a half now. So, at this point, what happens is fatigue really sets in, and we're no longer really able to see the end of the race or even care about the end because we're so tired, we're so fatigued. And this is where you have to really dig deep for those internal resources. And we talked last week a little bit about internal resources, last month, and about emotions in particular, and emotions that we're feeling. And just to recap something really important, when you're feeling apathetic, it's integral that you stop yourself. Think about what that emotion is telling you. Emotions are like an alarm system, and it's telling you something. Sometimes it's fight or flight. Other times, the emotion is stemming from frustration, anger, loss, grief. So if you can think about what those emotions might mean to you and put them into a context, I think it's easier to move on from them and process it. I'm going to switch ahead to where our starting point is going to be. I'm going to ask Gary if he wants to add something in the beginning.
Yeah, I would just like to get a feel from the folks on the call today in the chat function. If you were to rate your general daily stress level, if you will, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being you've got your drink in your hand, the pandemic never occurred, you're on the beach, to the 10 when, and you have to consider it as a 10, you've got your gun to your head. Okay, so that is as serious as the 10 gets. Where are you on your daily level? Is it, 1, 2, 5, 8? Just general ballpark figures. And the reason why we're doing this is number one, to get a feel for where folks are at. And number two, to start a conversation that your number is your number in this moment as you understand yourself. That number could be expected to change on a daily basis or on a weekly basis or not. This is where we're going to start talking about suspending judgment of self and judgment of others, or comparing yourself to others, because comparison is a thief of joy, as some people have said in the past. And it's not like we cannot compare ourselves to others. It's recognizing that we are. And so thank you very much for the numbers. I see that we've got some folks who are very blessed, I guess, with a nothing, with a 0. We actually said 1 to 10. So I don't think you quite got the number right. We'll consider your 0 as a 1 to quite pronounce. And so let's get into the discussion and see how we can use this information really to our advantage. So Sherry, back to you.
Thanks, Gary. So, some of you might feel like this. I know I do at times. It's an uphill climb, and I want to say, thanks to the JCC and WBI for providing an extraordinary support system this year. You have done an exemplary job of giving this gift to our community, a worldwide community of social support, emotional support, which is integral in coping and resilience. So thank you very much, Caroline. I want to thank Phoebe too, but I don't think Phoebe's on. So, when we talk about resilience, this is an interesting development in resilience research. 30 years ago, resilience was really seen as a trait, almost like a personality trait, to see a resilient guy. And as research moved into the hardiness research of the 80s and early 90s, into coping and resiliency research in the 90s particularly, scientists learned that research picks out different factors in a matrix of resilience. So resilience is very dynamic. It's something that you can grow, nurture, develop, change, become more resilient at in life. And that resilience is more of a dynamic interplay between experience and coping. So, when we talk about resilience, I want you to think about this, that this is a multi-system concept. It's dynamic and fluid, it's multifaceted. And managing your emotions and being resilient is not the same as denying them. We don't want toxic positivity here. Emotions and understanding emotions are something that must be validated, in fact, to move on from hitting the wall. So we're not going to ignore them. So, when we are discussing emotions and the processing of emotions, this is just a fun schematic of how you do that in your brain. And Gary can speak to this. I'm in the basement of the brain as a neuropsychologist, so I'm really interested in my research on coping and resilience, focused very much on that area in the middle. I call it like the Tootsie Roll inside of the Tootsie Pop lollipop. That's what I love to focus on. And it's this core area that makes us, well, human. The amygdala is the center that I studied. So this is our chief switching station for anger and anxiety and fear. And then what we do with that, how we move into action and respond to it, happens in the higher parts of the brain. But something comes beneath the basement, right? Gary, do you want to talk about what comes beneath the basement? It's the foundation, right? What's that foundation?
Absolutely. So the first question I would ask before I start into this is, can you answer a yes or no in the chat function if you have heard of the book, The Body Keeps Score? If you've read it, great. If you haven't read it, that's fine. But have you heard of it? And if you haven't, that's fine. So there's lots of yeses. Okay. So the no, for those of you, is there's a premise that is out there that says the body actually keeps score of the different things that you are exposed to. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that your liver has an operating memory like your brain. But what that does recognize is that the liver is connected to the brain. Obviously it is, or the liver wouldn't work. Every bit of your body is connected with your brain. And so when people talk about the body keeping score, it's a good reminder for us all that this wonderful thing that we have that sits in our body called the brain is in our body. And so when the body is stressed, when the body is exposed to toxicity, when the body does not get exercised, and we'll talk about this later, it creates a vessel that is unhealthy for the brain to sit in. It's like this pot where we've got this exotic, beautiful flower called the brain sitting in, but the pot is full of rotting chicken, not rich nutrients, right? So what Sherry was talking about earlier was the brainstem and the amygdala is kind of like this shaft that goes up into what eventually turns into the flower. We think the flower is this higher ordered center called the neocortex that kind of runs the show. But what we know from flowers and other things is it's really the base and the roots which actually help the flower thrive. And so Sherry kind of concentrates more in the I love the Tootsie Roll in the middle of the Tootsie Pop analogy. I actually work further down. My research was in the spinal cord. And the key thing about the spinal cord is this is the first place where all of those neurons from every bit of your body comes into the central nervous system. This is also the first place that we know of that develops memories of things like trauma. A painful event actually creates a memory trace that exists at the spinal level. It changes everything further up, but it also changes how the periphery works, how the actual skin and gut work. And so when we look at this matrix that Sherry described earlier, this is not metaphorical. We are absolutely talking that your skin cells, your liver, your kidneys, your heart, all have a dynamic input that comes into the brain and is all being influenced by the brain as well. And so when we start to try to change something, we need to realize that we're trying to change an entire system, not just one thing to get us through, say, a trauma. And we'll talk a little bit more about how this can be used to our advantage. But the biggest thing to realize right now is if we're not feeling that we're not changing very rapidly, it's because we're trying to change a system that is designed to stay as it is, even if that is in a traumatized state. But we can change it. And so Sherry, back to you, and we'll continue on.
Before you go on, Gary, can you just do me a favor and look at your, see if we can turn your microphone up just a little bit. I'm getting some requests to hear you a little bit more. So right by your microphone, little arrow, and just check that for me really quick to see in audio settings if you can turn that microphone up a little bit.
Well, let me see if just holding it closer, does that help?
That helps. Yeah.
That helps. I'll just hold it closer. So.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry for the interruption.
Sorry about that. No, I'm sorry. Yeah.
So just to tag on what Barry and what Gary said, in many ways, our bodies are a stage upon which the drama of our lives gets played out. And that's one of the main themes of, the body keeps the score. And, in order for us to move forward from now, I want to go backwards, like a couple of 100,000 years backwards. Okay. So we have something called the negativity bias, right? And this is, Rick Hansen is prolific on this topic. And he says, in effect, the brain is like Velcro for negative experiences, but Teflon for positive ones. Why is there a negativity bias, do you think? Well, it's very much a bioevolutionary process of survival. So when that saber-toothed tiger was chasing your ancestors 50,000 or more years ago, that bias that helped your ancestors stay alive. You can see this with all living organisms, all organisms, and you see this in humans today. We have a negativity bias. There's even a negativity bias in what entertains us on the internet when you're scrolling. Digital technology, social media has a negativity bias. So it's there for a reason, okay? And the main way that I perceive it is for survival, okay? It's like, if you guys remember Lost in Space, it was Danger, Will Robinson, okay? So Gary, do you want to talk a little bit about why the negativity bias is important, not to run away from it, but embrace it and harness it? Why is that important?
Yeah, so just recognizing that it is there is hugely important. And it's not something we can train ourselves out of. And it's not something we should try to train ourselves out of. And so the thing with the negativity bias is, when you think about this, it's better to jump away from a reed that moves like this over 100 times than to slip once and get bitten by a snake that moves like that. And so the negativity bias basically goes, it's better to overreact than it is to underreact and die. Okay? So that's evolutionarily wired in us. It still is in us. And so the key thing to remember is that we have this wiring within us. In the past, we used to fight or flee the things that stressed us. Now, instead of having real tigers, we have what are called paper tigers. These are things that stress us that are not really something that we can fight or flee from. So we've got this stress that is around all the time, stressing a system that we can't evolve out of and we don't want to anyway. But we're not taking the time to process the stress. And if you think about what fighting and fleeing were back in the day when they were real tigers, we call that exercise now. Because fighting and fleeing, you try running or you try boxing, that's a heck of a workout. What that does is that processes all of the stress hormones that are released in the moment of the stress. And so if somebody asks about cortisol, how can cortisol be controlled or mitigated? It can't. You don't want it to be. It is doing its job. What you want to do is you want it to be released to do its job, and then you want to process it. If you want it to be controlled, don't try it by food, don't try it by anything else. Do it with exercise. If you're feeling stressed, the best thing for you to do is to get outside and vigorously walk if you can do that. It's in the moment, not hours later, because that's not natural. Natural is to fight or flee. So the negativity bias is something that was designed to keep us alive, and thankfully it was. It's that we're trying to force that system into an artificial way of living. Don't try that. Go back to the original way of living, and that's getting outside, running away from your problems, literally for a while. It's okay. And then come back. Once you've exercised, then your system is reset.
So one of the things, thank you, Gary, because that's so helpful. And I think one of the things that's really interesting about cortisol, we talked a little bit about it last time. People are fascinated by it. Cortisol levels have been used in multiple stress studies going back 50 years. So, cortisol is not something that's bad or good. It is. It's important to understand cortisol levels. And there are some folks that actually have a medical condition where you have too high of a level of cortisol, for example. So, you can have too high of a level, and that's actually a syndrome and a type of medical syndrome that needs to be addressed pharmaceutically. But also in our lives, for those of us who are not with a medical condition, our cortisol levels can change, not just with a situation, but also by knowledge or what you're told about a situation and your perception of a situation. So it's a stress hormone that is very interesting because it's not only a real threat, but it can be a perceived threat, or conversely, a perceived way around a threat. So, Gary and I have both studied in different ways post-traumatic growth and how you move on. And, my perception of post-traumatic growth might be a little bit different than Gary's, even though, we're going in the same direction. We might take different paths. My perception of it is very much being able to incorporate what you have learned, grown through, experienced, processed, and gained from coping to moving on in your life, maybe in a richer way, a smarter way, a more strategic way, and actually becoming stronger through the adversity. I studied this for 15 years of my life in kids and young adults and how they became resilient after trauma. And the overriding feature of the growth in my teens, kids, and young adults was social support. Having that supportive family or having community support. That was the number one factor, the highest loading factor for post-traumatic growth and coping and resilience long-term. I'm talking 10 years out in a longitudinal study. So Gary, tell us a little bit about your post-traumatic growth, how you conceive it, and how do you get it?
Absolutely. So hopefully you can hear me a little bit better.
Yeah,
Oh, very good. Okay, so before I talk about that, I do want to address a couple of the questions in the chat function that said, if you're disabled and can't get out, or if you have stress when you first wake up and you can't get out, what do you do? And so the first answer might sound contrite, but it's not. It is a true way of operating, and it's an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And that means the best medicine is to not get stressed at all. Now, if you can't do that and you find yourself stressed, there is always something you can do. If you can't get outside and walk, you can do this with your arm. You can do this. You can do whatever range of motion your body is allowed to do based on your physiology in order to get your heart rate up. The important thing is you need to get the heart rate up. The blood starts flowing to the liver and to the kidneys so that it can start to metabolize the stuff that it was released by the stress. So whatever your trick is to go ahead and do what you can. Now, the important thing is, and this is where we get back to post-traumatic growth, is be sure to tie the behaviors that you do to a positive thought. Okay. So the one thing that we now know that some people used to um, encourage was something called anger management, where you would grab a pillow and hit it when you were stressed because it's a physical exercise. You're doing something to get your heart rate up. But what you do in that is you tie a stressful event with a behavior of violence to cope with the situation. Now, if you find yourself in the grocery store and there's no pillow around and you get stressed, guess what you do? You turn to the next person and hit them like they are a pillow because that's your coping mechanism. So when you have a stress, tie it to a positive physical behavior that will allow you to process the chemicals, if you will. Now, the thing that you mentioned, Sherry, about pro-sociality or the supportive structures that we have around us are absolutely critical. So sometimes talking is a very effective next step. And so if you can't actually physically do anything, what you can do is reach out to somebody and to talk with them to help you process on a mental level what you can't process physically. Okay. So what we're talking about is post-traumatic growth is the ability both within yourself and around yourself to get through the stress. Basically, we have to have both. We have to have the internal mechanisms and we have to have the supportive external structures to help us through. The key thing is if you find something is not working for you in the moment, try something else. Don't keep trying the same thing. It's like trying the same medicine that may not work. It's like, yeah, there's always something else you can do. So definitely try something else. Sherry, I'll turn it back up to you and see what some of the other questions are.
Thanks, Gary. So, and Gary mentioned trying to avoid stress, and stress is not always bad. There's eustress or good stress, the stress that challenges us, the stress where we feel like we can overcome something, where we feel competent, where we feel in control. Stress can lead to the psychological construct of flow, where you feel highly challenged, highly in control, and it makes us feel really great. And we have really good hormones that come out of that. But there's a smart way that I like to manage stress in a positive way, which is I call shooting par every day. That's practice for positive reframing. So I prepare in advance, if I can, for stressors that I know are going to be on the road ahead of me. If I can prepare in advance, I can anticipate, what might be a stressor today. Maybe I'm anticipating a meeting with someone that's going to be very stressful. Maybe I'm anticipating a really tough commute to work, or traveling on a plane, or having to do something I don't like taxes. So I prepare for that. I think about what the situation is going to be. I prepare in advance for what I want my optimal response to be. I'm actually already thinking about response choices before the event happens. That also gives me a sense of perceived control. When I'm going through the stressor, when I wake up, I accommodate. I ride that wave of stress. I realize it's not going to be forever. I try to get support if I can by having a conversation with someone or dialoguing or doing the breathing exercises that Megan taught us at the top of the show. And when I get through it, I reframe it. You know, that really wasn't that bad. I learned something from that situation. Maybe that person was rude to me, but I learned something and I didn't lose my cool. Or maybe, you know, I was stressed out in traffic and it was like, okay, I was rerouted, but I learned a new way of getting to the city. Or I was really stressed out talking to, you know, my boss today, but you know what? I didn't lose my cool. I didn't lose my job. I shared what I needed to share. I feel better that I got things off my chest. So any way that you can reframe, and that's the PAR, prepare, accommodate, and reframe. So, you know, that's one way of just sort of beating the stress if you can. So when we're growing, I really love these two dynamic, foundational constructs of the Whole Being Institute. And these are two ways of enacting positive change and really cultivating happiness in your life. You know, we've had Megan on and we've had Phoebe on talking about this. Tal, you know, had this great quote, Tal Ben-Shahar. The first thing to do to become happier, paradoxically, is to accept painful emotions. That's what Gary was talking about. To accept them as a part and parcel of being alive. They help us. It gives us that psychological immune system boost that we need. We have to endure and grow from it. So how do we enact change for the good? Well, when we look at this SPIRE model, which Caroline talked about at the top of the program, my view of it as a psychologist is that this is what our foundation should be. We should have this in our life. These are the key factors, evidence-based factors on happiness research, on resilience research, that allows us to grow from our experiences in a positive way. Spirituality, the physicality or the physical endeavors and experiences that Gary talked about, being intellectually challenged, right? The relationships that we have, right? The relationships that we have with each other. And then, you know, the energy work, the experiences, the exercise of feeling productive in our life and nurturing our bodies and in our spirit. So these are key factors that have actually been studied and that you should have as your foundation. Now, how do we go about the process of change? Well, that's the change model that I love. And I think this is a really strong way to develop a game plan for moving past that wall that we've hit, or changing your life for the better, or trying a new way of going about coping. The C stands for clarifying, or clarify your goals, create clear and heartfelt goals for positive change. The H is the power of hope. H is for hope. Explore your strengths and resources and that fuel your optimism. Be hopeful. Surround yourself with hopeful people and positive people. That's part of that hope. A is really the big challenge of change is the activation. Activate it. Activate the change process. You know, you want immediate positive action, and that also is something that's integral in cognitive behavioral therapy as well as positive psychology. Behavioral activation. Do something. Make one step forward. Gary, do you want to add to that? Because that is that A is so important.
Yeah, there's a beautiful Japanese proverb or saying that that says, um, hope. I'm sorry. Action without thought is a nightmare, but thought without action is a daydream.
Oh,
And so it's
wow.
basically we have to have both foresight and action for
Mhm,
something to go well. If all we do is live up in our head and
mhm.
don't do anything, it can be a beautiful daydream, but it's a daydream. Now, importantly, what is coming up is the go for it is a little bit different in that if we don't plan well, if we don't have that clarity and we just simply go for something, in like running terms, it would be you're heading for the finish line, but you're starting in the wrong direction.
Right.
The finish line is going to be still there, but you're going to be going in the wrong direction. So that's
And that speaks to the N, the navigate also. And oftentimes we don't move beyond, or we don't change our lives, or we don't move forward because we have knowledge gaps. Okay. We might not know what opportunities are out there. We might not even have taken adequate stock in our own strengths or experiences. We might need help with that navigation stage, is making a goal map, figuring out what I want to do and how to get there. We might not know it, and that's where we need help. Social support, we might need coaching there, we might need even to do a lot of exploration. So you can still explore possibilities without making a commitment. And then G's the go for it, right, Gary? Do you want to take on the G?
yeah. So the go for it is a very nuanced part of this particular acronym, because go for it means you do need to commit. You do need to actually step out. In running terms, you need to take the first step, and then you need to take the second step and the third step and the 500,000th step. And so going for it is really that commitment. That commitment doesn't mean you cannot change if you find yourself going off course. So none of these are to be seen as absolute in both magnitude and and past decisions. It's there has to be flexibility built into this entire thing. Going for it does mean restarting, re-going forward, so evolving the steps that take you forward as your journey goes forward. But it's not copping out, it's not giving up, it's knowing that every step is okay, even if it's a misstep, even if you fall, lay down, look up at
Yeah.
the sky, look at the clouds or the stars and go, well, that was fun, and then eventually get back up and start again.
So, and Gary, the E part is also really important to growth, right?
Absolutely, and I love the questions in the chat box as well. So the E part of this, the expand, is just a recognition that very similar to the way we started. Trauma and resiliency is a matrix. So when we start to expand, we can start to realize that we may not have all of the resources that we need to get us to the finish line, to get us through the race. And so
Mhm.
expanding is allowing ourselves to accumulate the skill set as we go. Don't expect ourselves to be fully completed before we finish the race. The only thing we need to do is finish the race. We don't have to be even done growing when we finish the race. And so it's one of these things that we do need to go. And so go for it or go forward is a beautiful question, Mega, because it's like sometimes we need to go backwards. If there's a barrier in
Yeah.
front of us that we can't get around, maybe we need to go sideways to get around it to go. Maybe we need to choose a different path and start that path anew. It's not something that is necessarily bad because we have experience and we have insight, and if we reframe, like is the R in PAR, we can see that nothing is necessarily wasted. It's just time invested, it's resources invested. So
So,
going forward, I agree, is not necessarily forward, it's just going.
and this is why I think, the E in the spire is so important for the emotional support. because you need that along the way for, for all these changes that are, it's in our lives.
Absolutely. And so
Aspire.
yep. And so the spire is one thing that we've talked about before. But before we go on to this 4 factors leading to post-traumatic growth, there was one question that I wanted to address. I'm scrolling up to see it because I think it's a very, very important thing. So Joy asked, what are the characteristics of adults when, as young children, separation from parents or other things basically occurred? So the past made us who we are. And so we cannot change the past. Now, the key thing with resilience research is that most of us have been scarred when we were kids. They're called adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. We know that the more adverse childhood experiences we have equates to or correlates with poorer health as an adult. So we can't erase those ACEs, but what we can do is we can actually reframe them. We can start to see and reframe our history that we remember to go, maybe they weren't as bad as I remember them. Now, the key thing with reframing is we know we don't objectively remember the past anyway. Now we'll accuse our spouses of changing their their history, if you will, all the time, but very rarely do we stand kind of in our own light and go, I don't remember the past. Well, studies show we clearly do not remember events that even are very traumatic, like the Challenger experiment that happened a couple of years ago, well, quite a few years ago now, and the 9/11 experiences. People have false memories of where they were, what they were doing, how they felt, how things unfolded. And the key thing is not trying to go, I'm right, but going, it happens. I don't remember things objectively. So how can I use that as a benefit for me? So why don't we just simply go back, and maybe my dad wasn't as physical with me as I thought he was. We don't know. So why not just go, what I can do now is go, my father was angry and he cared enough, but he didn't know how to handle his anger. I forgive him. So I'm holding on to the past. He's not. I'm reframing it. And so this is what I wanted to address with Joy is, Joy, the one of the key areas of research is that we are not scarred for life if something happened to us in the past. So even if it was during our developmental stages, we can't erase that past. We cannot, absolutely cannot erase it. Well, what we can do is we can reframe it. We can start to layer on positive current emotions onto the traumatic past memories, and we'll start to slowly change them over time. And that's not a metaphorical thing. We actually change the memories that we have as we remember them. So we're not computers. We don't read and write the memories the same way. So if we remember something in a very cranky state or in a fear-based state, we layer on that anger or that fear on top of the memory, making it worse. Why not layer compassion and maybe patience and understanding on top of those? The past is the past. We can change how we actually view it. That's the important thing here.
Well, in addition, and that's like that's Gary, that's is so important, and that's really a very deep conversation to have, and when you think about it. And this has been said before on during these wonderful webinars. When we talk about forgiveness, it might not be forgiveness, it might be your ability to unhook yourself from that person so they don't continue to bring you down. So, there's ways of reframing your life, reframing your experiences that are going to be more positive. And the studies that are out there and there's a recent meta-analysis that was just published on the topic that I think Joy asked about, what happens if you've had adverse childhood experiences. The most recent research, which was a meta-analysis of dozens of studies, showed that the number one loading factor was familial support and or social support in your life throughout your life, not just in childhood, but then later on as an adult. So I'm going to move on because this leads us to, these are key factors, again, in post-traumatic stress: optimism, perception of control over events. That speaks to Gary's point about how we perceive it and our perception of control, and reframing those perceptions. Your coping style: do you cope in a healthy way, or do you cope in an unhealthy way? Our coping style, healthy coping styles include seeking social support, stress busting exercise, maybe trying a new way of looking at things, cognitive reframing, seeking the type of social networks that are going to bring you up, changing a new direction. There are bad coping styles, like things that are bad for your health, overindulging in alcohol, food, using illegal substances, and then having a strong sense of self. These are the 4 factors that lead to post-traumatic growth. And as you can see, many of them tie into the SPIRE and change models. So, Gary often says, when our adverse experiences when we're younger and the stressors we have in our life are they're building our emotional resilience. All the exposures to low-level pathogens teach us as kids, as we grow up, how to cope better, how to handle the stressors and the losses in life and the disappointments in life. And it's, how you choose to live through those. I think your choice in responding, your choice in reframing. So we know that resilience is energized in times of crisis by these 4 key factors: your coping mechanism, tapping into those inner resources, understanding what happened in your life. We're going to talk about meaning at the end of this. Emotional intelligence, your ability to acknowledge and manage your feelings and frame situations positively. That grit, stick with it, don't give up. Angela Duckworth has a great new article about grit, just came out. Making meaning, make sense of experiences. Making meaning, that narrative. What's this all about? Why did this happen? What is the meaning and purpose of all this? We talked about this. That's Gary, and that's his bowls that he made out of the cancer on the tree, right, Gary?
Yes, absolutely.
That's it. So, because we're running out of time, I just want to talk about this. Your narrative is something that's very important. That's tying together what Gary and I have told you this afternoon. Your narrative is very important in post-traumatic growth. And I'm going to toss that one to Gary.
Yeah, and this is a good introduction to a couple of the questions I would like to answer. And so Anita asks, how can one discriminate between reframing and creating a false sense of narrative of the past? And this is a beautiful question, because the only thing we have is the present moment. And so if we reframe something in the past, there is no harm. And so we're not necessarily creating a false narrative, because we don't remember it correctly anyway. And so it is by definition a false narrative. You don't remember something 100% objectively. So everything we remember is a false narrative by that definition. And so it's just a matter of degrees. But the important thing is we don't try to force that narrative on somebody else that we are right. And that gets into, I think, one thing that Jill said is that, what about this? It seems very rigid. Well, that's a narrative that is incorrect. This is not, none of these models are rigid. They're all flexible. It's how we see them. And so if something sounds rigid, it can be reframed. It can be questioned. It can be said, something can say, it sounds rigid. How can I find flexibility within this? So even if something does sound rigid, we can create a different narrative around it to help ourselves. And so these are not just tricks, but these are the ways that we change our neuronal patterning. And so when we change our thoughts about something, we're not talking about touchy-feely things that are esoteric. We are literally changing the synapses within our brain and how that operates with other parts of our brain. And so this is where we go. Reframing is a false narrative. Of course it is, but so is the past. Unless we are recording it with a VCR, a camcorder or something, it is a false narrative, okay? But that doesn't mean we can't actually use it to our advantage. So the other thing here is how do we help this grow? Well, we realize that it is within our control to grow. So if I don't believe I can get past something, I have created a narrative and I will prove myself correct that I cannot change. If I have a narrative that I might struggle trying to change, then that's a struggle. I can struggle. If I go, I can struggle maybe through this and help myself, that's a different narrative. And so the narrative is, I don't want to say everything, because the narrative without the action is nothing. That's that daydream. And so the narrative is necessary, but insufficient to get us to where we need to go. We have to have both. Now, if what we are doing is not working for us, the best thing we can do is take a big, deep breath and go, well, that was interesting. Okay, now I know what doesn't work. Why would I continue doing that? What can I change? What tiny little thing or what other things can I change to try something else? And so we may feel like we are behind the eight ball. I love these questions, because we may not just feel like we're behind the eight ball. We may have a giant eight ball running us over from behind. That's the reality of life. We may actually encounter something like that. If it does, we pick ourselves back up. If we can pick ourselves back up, we're well served. And we may fall down another 8 times, get run over another 8 times. But if we keep getting up that ninth or that subsequent time, we will never be stuck. We need to journey. We need to set out. We need to realize that we can actually keep going, because we really do in the end have 2 choices. We can give up or we can keep going. Now, unless you're willing to truly give up, and that's that gun at your head, which I do not recommend, you will keep going. Okay, so how do you make tomorrow that incremental step better than today? Don't try to shoot for the moon. Just make tomorrow a little bit better. And then the next day a little bit better. And that's how you do actually a 100-mile run. It's just a series of steps. You can take a step. You can actually do a 100-mile run. It may take you a very long time, but you can do it.
I think, one of the things you can do is convert long-term goals into a short-term plan. And that's achievable, that you can do. And Gary and I have had long talks about this with PTSD research and our experiences as clinicians. There are some people that hang on and hold on to not moving forward. And that's important to explore. I validate that. I don't criticize it. I totally want to explore that. And one of the things that keeps us from moving on is anger. That's one emotion that keeps us from growing. So if you feel that way about not moving on, not wanting to move on, or not moving on, but moving on does not mean moving or denying what happened. It's growing. That's what we mean. It's not denying what happened. It's not generating a false narrative. It's embracing what happened and figuring out, how does this tie into your life's purpose and meaning? It's very deep. So we talked about some really important life issues today, Gary and Caroline. I know our time is up, and I wanted to get to a question if anybody had a question that didn't get addressed.
There was one about just metabolizing cortisol.
Oh,
and the just to generally answer that really quickly, is that everything in the body gets metabolized. Matter of fact, every atom in your body gets replaced at least every 7 to 10 years. And so if you don't think that you're able to change, you literally change. This is not metaphorical. You literally change every atom in your body. So you are a different person than you were 10 years ago. So you're never stuck. You may feel like you're circling round and round, but you're never fully stuck. So to metabolize just simply is a natural process. And so yeah, I'll get to the Japanese proverb in a bit, but it's just simply recognizing that movement is growth, because we need the stuff that served us in a moment to be gone very quickly. So
I just want to get to Patricia just real quick. Validation is so important. That's a key component of that social support we talked about, being validated and having your emotions and your experiences validated. And invalidation is one of the roadblocks to post-traumatic growth, or even sensing that you're invalidated. So having that emotional support, that emotional connectedness and validation, which is a foundation of the SPIRE model, which is in the change model, which is in resilience research, it's crucial. Thank you for bringing that up.
beautiful. Just one last thing to finish on. I misquoted the Japanese proverb just slightly, but I put it in the chat function, and it has to do with vision without action is a daydream. Action without vision is the nightmare. So, but realize that the biggest thing that I would end on is realize that tomorrow is always another day, but this breath is a restart. You don't have to wait until tomorrow. You can reset your life right now with your breath. Not everything is solved, but you can actually start to reframe things in this moment with your breath.
Yeah.
I just think this was such a fascinating discussion today. I think one of the things that struck me was, when you were saying, Gary, that the past is an inaccurate description of reality too, right? So reframing how we see something can be a very powerful tool. And that, I think, is a function of the mind, right? That we think that we actually believe that the way we remember something from the past is accurate, but it's not.
Absolutely. You have more power than you realize over your brain. You really do. And how you think, your perceptions, how you cope actually has an impact on the physical brain, which I don't think most people know.
Amazing, right? So I'm going to take off all the spotlights. Thank you again, you guys. If anybody wants to unmute and thank our speakers, please do so. It's just amazing to spend time with both of you and hear you talk.
Thank you. Thanks for this honor.
Amazing. As always, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. It's an honor to be here with you.
Thank you.
Please stay tuned for Thursday. We'll be here with Winnie Zeeb talking about bliss and how to create bliss through movement, the NEO technique and positive psychology. We're going to be going into savoring, and I think you're going to enjoy it. And as Gary said, it doesn't matter if you move the whole body or just a part, just get moving. Thanks, everyone.
Caroline, is it an exercise class on Thursday?
Yes, we will be moving. I wouldn't call it an exercise class, but we will be moving. Yeah.
Okay. And Megan will be here next Tuesday. Megan's going to be dancing with you guys next Tuesday.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye now.